Welcome, everyone. Glad you could join us today as we take a deep dive, a deep dive into the work of this fascinating economist, Jose Luis Sampedro. And, it's funny, he wasn't just an economist, right? He was also a well-known novelist.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it, how those two worlds kind of collide in his work.
Totally.
You see that human-centric perspective, really shining through his economic ideas, which isn't always the case. I mean, with economists, right?
No, definitely not. It's refreshing, honestly.
Yeah.
In fact, some of his own economics students get this, were mostly interested in his novels.
Yeah.
It's true. They were drawn to his storytelling.
It speaks to his ability to connect with people on that human level.
Absolutely. But okay, let's dive into some of his economic ideas.
Okay.
One thing that really struck me, going way back to some of his earlier writings, was his work from 1947 on those depressed areas in Britain.
Yeah.
I mean, can you believe he was already talking about, like, a decline in what he called vital impetus back then
That's fascinating.
in the late 1940s? And, it got me thinking, like, does this resonate with anyone listening? This whole idea of labor mobility, right? Regional development, the human side of economic shifts, these aren't new issues. These are things Sampedro was grappling with decades ago.
Yeah, and what's interesting is how he ties this vital impetus to labor mobility, right? He makes this really interesting comparison to the Industrial Revolution, this period of such dynamism where workers were, much more geographically mobile. They were willing to move to opportunity. And he even tells this story about the 1930s where there was actually resistance among workers to relocating from these depressed areas, even with, government incentives.
Wow.
And it's a stark contrast, isn't it, to that self-driven migration that characterized the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, it's like he's seeing this shift happening, right? Toward less mobility, less of that individual drive that fueled so much economic change in the past.
Yeah, absolutely.
So where do you see this idea going in his later work?
That's a great question. I think for Sampedro, this dip in vital impetus was a symptom of a larger shift in values. He felt like people were, maybe moving away from that self-reliance and towards this more passive acceptance of the way things are.
And it's almost like he's using this idea, this declining vital impetus, to challenge traditional economics at its core.
Oh, absolutely.
Because he really takes aim at this whole Homo economicus concept.
Yeah.
This idea that humans are, these perfectly rational actors.
Yeah, like we're all just walking calculators or something.
Exactly. And Sampedro's like, come on, we're way more complex than that.
Totally. He saw right through that. And that's where his critique of Homo economicus gets really interesting, I think. He's basically arguing that this model is, well, it's just way too simplistic. It completely ignores the messiness of actual human behavior, our emotions, our values, our upbringing, all of that shapes how we make economic choices.
It's like, we're not robots.
Exactly.
Sometimes the heart wants what the spreadsheet doesn't, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, Sampedro didn't stop there. I mean, he even went on to criticize the market itself, called it the great corrupter.
Ooh.
Yeah. He argued that it reduces everything to its monetary value.
Which, that's a pretty bold statement. What led him to that conclusion?
Well, he was deeply concerned about how the market often prioritizes profit above all else, even over things like, social well-being, ethical considerations, those things you can't really put a price tag on.
Right.
It's like, think about it. The market doesn't inherently value something like the beauty of the moon or just, simple acts of generosity. Unless, of course, there's a way to package it and sell it.
Wow.
Yeah.
When you put it like that, it really makes you think. So if this purely market-driven approach isn't the answer, what was Sampedro suggesting? What's the alternative?
Well, he believed we need a more balanced approach to economics, a more ethical framework, one that emphasizes things like self-restraint, strong social institutions, individual responsibility guided by shared values, not just the pursuit of profit. He even quotes the philosopher Albert Camus, who wrote about the dangers of this unchecked pursuit of, having it all.
It's this idea that we need to find a balance, right?
Yes.
Between economic progress and social responsibility.
Exactly.
It's not just about how much wealth we generate, but how we generate it. The impact it has on our communities, our environment, the world around us.
Absolutely. And that leads us to another fascinating aspect of Sampedro's thinking, his views on development.
Okay.
Particularly in the context of, regions like his own Andalusia.
Right.
He seemed wary of just copying the models of more developed nations. He sensed it wasn't a one-size-fits-all situation.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole sometimes, you know. trying to impose a model that might not be the right fit.
Exactly. And that's where his concept of dependent underdevelopment comes in, right?
Okay.
He argues that regions like Andalusia, they face this really unique challenge. They're part of these larger systems, but those systems often don't work in their favor, you know? It creates this kind of like this cycle of dependence. It's not just about catching up economically. It's about recognizing those power imbalances, you know, and finding ways to break free.
And he actually suggests that traditional economics struggles to even grasp this idea, this dependent underdevelopment. What makes it so hard to understand using those traditional economic models?
Well, he uses this analogy. I love this analogy. He talks about the horse and rider. Right.
Okay.
So imagine like the more developed nation or region is the rider,
Got it.
holding the reins, setting the pace, and the less developed region is the horse.
Okay.
So they might be moving forward together, but the horse doesn't have much say in the direction, you know?
Right. They're not really in control.
Exactly. And that's what he saw happening in these situations of dependent underdevelopment.
So if the traditional model doesn't work, what's the alternative? You mentioned earlier that Sampedro was a big believer in the power of regions to kind of forge their own paths.
Absolutely. He felt strongly that regions, they need to define what development means for them, you know? What are their strengths? What do their people aspire to? He gives this great example of creating a regional television station in Seville, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something that can shape their own narratives, their own cultural identity. It's about taking ownership, you know?
It's about controlling your own story
Exactly.
instead of letting someone else tell it for you. And this idea of development wasn't just about economics for Sampedro, was it?
No, not at all. It's much bigger than that.
Yeah.
For him, it had to involve this like deeper cultural shift. It wasn't enough to just, you know, accumulate wealth. It was about moving away from this purely consumerist mindset, you know,
Okay.
towards a more balanced, a more fulfilling way of life. And interestingly, he saw the Mediterranean region, you know, his own backyard, as kind of this like wellspring for this kind of shift.
Really?
Yeah, with its rich history, its traditions, he felt it offered this different vision of, you know, what a good life could look like.
Wow. It's amazing how much his work still resonates today, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about globalization, inequality, environmental concerns. These are all things that Sampedro was grappling with decades ago.
Yeah.
So if our listeners could take away just a few key insights from his work, what would those be?
You know, I think Sampedro's work offers this really powerful counter-narrative to how we traditionally think about economics and development. Firstly, he challenges us to, you know, to really question those deeply ingrained assumptions. Don't just accept the models at face value. Dig deeper. Understand the human impact, you know?
Right.
The social and cultural nuances that often get missed in those big economic theories.
Yeah. It's about looking beyond the numbers.
Right.
Understanding that there's more at play than just GDP and economic growth.
Absolutely. He also reminds us of the power, the agency that exists in those spaces that are often relegated to the periphery.
The margins.
Exactly. Those regions, those communities, those groups that have been marginalized, they have a critical role to play, you know, in shaping a more just and sustainable future.
That's a powerful idea. It's almost like Sampedro saying the ones on the outside, the ones who haven't quite fit the mold, they might be the key to unlocking something new.
Exactly. And he has this great metaphor. He says, Las torres que destrece alare fueron a su gran pesadumbre se rindieron. It means the towers I scorned surrendered to their great sorrow. Basically, even those seemingly unshakable structures of power, they can change.
Wow. What a powerful image to end on. And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought. If, as Sampedro argues, we need a more human-centered economics, a more ethical approach, how do we actually make that happen within our current systems? It's something to think about as you continue to explore these ideas. Thanks for joining us.